Hey guys, tonight we begin with medieval vegetables. I know, thrilling, but not these vegetables. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Purslane was the kind of plant medieval authorities deeply distrusted, not because it poisoned people, caused riots, or worshipped the devil, but because it refused to behave like a proper crop. It didn't line up neatly and rose. It didn't wait for permission. It didn't even pretend to care who owned the land. Plain simply appeared like an uninvited guest who also happens to cook better than you. It thrived in drought. It shrugged at poor soil. It grew in cracks between stones, along roads, in courtyards, and occasionally in places that made people stare at the ground and say, "How is that even possible?" Medieval peasants didn't plant person that would imply effort. They noticed it one day, realized it hadn't died despite everything working against it, and sensibly decided to eat it. This alone placed Plain several steps ahead of most medieval decision-making processes. Nutritionally, Purslane was borderline offensive. It was packed with vitamins, minerals, and healthy fats at a time when most diets consisted of bread, regret, and whatever boiled long enough to stop fighting back. It stayed green when respectable vegetables collapsed under the mild pressure of reality. It didn't require fertilizer, irrigation, or motivational speeches. It simply existed, which in medieval agriculture was considered suspicious behavior. And here's where things got uncomfortable. Food was supposed to come from fields. Fields were measured. Fields were taxed. Fields came with obligations. Plains skipped all of that. It turned roadsides into pantries and walls into grocery stores. No lord assigned it. No priest blessed it. No steward could count it without crouching awkwardly and admitting he'd lost control of the situation. So, authorities did what humans always do when confronted with something useful but inconvenient. They called it a weed. Weed is not a scientific term. It is an emotional response. It means this plant works too well and is not respecting the rules. Monastic gardens quietly grew person because monks appreciated food that didn't die out of spite. Medical texts praised it, healers used it, but peasants eating it freely that felt dangerous. A peasant who didn't need grain was a peasant who didn't panic during shortages. And calm peasants historically make everyone nervous. So Plain wasn't banned loudly. It was ignored aggressively, forgotten deliberately, mocked politely. Because destroying a plant that grows everywhere is hard. Convincing people it's worthless is much easier. And Purslane, stubborn as ever, kept growing anyway, waiting patiently for humanity to remember it had made a mistake. Salsify was never flashy. It didn't shout for attention. It didn't grow in proud, visible abundance. In fact, if you judged it by appearances alone, you'd assume it had already failed. Above ground, Salify looked thin, unimpressive, and vaguely apologetic, like a plant that had shown up to the medieval food system, knowing it wouldn't be taken seriously. Underground, however, Salify was quietly thriving. Its long, sturdy root plunged deep into the soil, safely tucked away from frost, drought, grazing animals, and the general chaos of medieval farming. While other crops panicked at the first sign of bad weather, Salify calmly continued its business below the surface, collecting nutrients and waiting for someone intelligent enough to dig it up. Medieval peasants figured this out quickly. Salify didn't need rich soil. It didn't demand constant attention. It didn't collapse emotionally during a cold snap. You planted it once and mostly forgot about it, which made it wildly efficient and unfortunately deeply suspicious. Because here's the problem. Medieval agricultural systems loved visible effort. They loved fields that could be inspected, counted, taxed, and admired by passing officials who needed to feel useful. Salify hid. You couldn't easily assess how much was growing. You couldn't tell who had more. You couldn't panic peasants by threatening their harvest when half of it was literally underground, minding its own business. Even worse, salify was nutritious. It provided carbohydrates, minerals, and enough sustenance to get people through lean months without begging for grain from centralized stores. This was not the plan. The plan involved peasants being hungry, worried, and emotionally available for obedience. Medical writers praised salsify as strengthening and restorative, which should have been a compliment, but instead added to its suspicious reputation. Food that healed people reduced their need for expensive remedies, and charitable institutions and medieval power structures were very invested in being needed. So salsify slowly fell out of favor, not through bans or dramatic decrees, but through quiet neglect. It was labeled unfashionable, old-fashioned, a root for desperate times, something you ate when better food wasn't available, which conveniently discouraged anyone from admitting it worked perfectly well. Above ground, calcife remained humble and forgettable. Below ground, it fed people reliably through winters and bad years. And like many things in medieval history, it wasn't removed because it failed. It was removed because it succeeded too quietly to be controlled. Lovage was the medieval equivalent of that one friend who was good at everything, and therefore deeply resented. It was a vegetable, a herb, and a medicine all at once, which already put it on thin ice with anyone who preferred clear categories and tidy control. Love didn't respect boundaries. It flavored food, cured stomach problems, eased pain, and grew back year after year, like it had signed a long-term lease with the soil. This plant was enormous by herb standards. Tall, leafy, confident. You didn't need much of it because lovage was potent. A little went a long way, which immediately made it suspicious. Medieval systems preferred crops that required constant labor, constant oversight, and constant reminding of who was in charge. Lovage just showed up and did its job. Peasants loved it. It made bland food taste less like punishment. It helped digestion after meals that consisted mainly of bread and optimism. It also reduced reliance on apothecaries, healers, and monastery medicine chests, which was convenient for peasants and awkward for institutions that enjoyed being the sole providers of relief. Medical texts praised lovage openly. It was recommended for bloating, pain, and general bodily distress, which in medieval life was basically everything. Monasteries grew it behind walls where knowledge could be controlled and dispensed carefully, but peasants, growing lovage freely in their gardens, that felt excessive, empowering even. Lovage also had the audacity to improve soil health. It attracted beneficial insects, shaded the ground, and cooperated politely with neighboring plants. This was not how agriculture was supposed to work. Crops were meant to struggle. Struggle justified hierarchy. A plant that made life easier undermined the narrative. There was also the issue of superstition. Lovage was associated with love, attraction, and emotional well-being, which medieval authorities found unsettling. Anything that encouraged joy, comfort, or self-confidence among peasants was viewed with suspicion. Happy people asked questions, so lovage wasn't banned dramatically. No one marched into gardens shouting orders. Instead, it was slowly framed as excessive, old-fashioned, or medicinal rather than culinary, something useful in small amounts, preferably under supervision. Peasants adapted, of course. They always did. But over time, lovage slipped into the margins, remembered vaguely, used quietly, and eventually replaced by weaker, more manageable alternatives. Not because lovage was dangerous, but because it made people too comfortable. And comfort, historically speaking, has always made those in charge nervous. Skirt was sweet, starchy, and scandalously reliable. Three traits that immediately put it at odds with medieval agricultural expectations. It produced clusters of long, pale roots that tasted pleasantly sugary when cooked, which made it suspiciously enjoyable. Food, according to medieval logic, was not supposed to be enjoyable unless you were very wealthy or very drunk. Skirt thrived in cold climates and tolerated wet soil, frost, and neglect with quiet confidence, while other crops sulked and failed under the slightest inconvenience. Skirit kept growing underground, like it had accepted winter as a personal challenge. It didn't need rich land. It didn't demand constant care. It didn't panic during bad years. It just showed up when people needed it most. Naturally, peasants loved it. Skirit filled bellies during grain shortages. It provided calories without dependence on lord-controlled bread supplies. It grew in places where wheat simply refused to cooperate. And worst of all, it required patience rather than labor. You planted it once and waited, which meant peasants weren't constantly visible, sweating, and obedient in the fields. That last part was deeply troubling. Medieval systems preferred crops that demanded endless attention. Attention kept people busy. Busy people didn't organize, complain, or notice that their landlord owned most of the warmth and all of the firewood. Skirit disrupted that rhythm. It quietly promised food without constant suffering, which was frankly an unacceptable business model. Even elite households enjoyed Skirit. It appeared in noble kitchens, praised for its sweetness and versatility. But once a food becomes popular among peasants and elites, it creates an uncomfortable overlap, and medieval society was built entirely on separation. So, Skirit began to be framed as old-fashioned, rural, unsophisticated, something you ate when food wasn't available, even though everyone knew it tasted good. This social downgrade made it easier to abandon Skyr without admitting the real reason. It worked too well. Over time, Skirit was replaced by crops that required more labor, more fertilizer, and more centralized oversight. Crops that failed dramatically, ensuring people remained appropriately anxious. Skirit didn't disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because it was dependable. And in medieval agriculture, dependability in the wrong hands was a threat. Good King Henry was not named after a generous monarch, despite what the name suggests. No crown, no castle, no tragic dynasty. It was named because medieval people had a habit of calling useful things good, usually right before someone else decided they were inconvenient. And good King Henry was very inconvenient. This leafy green grew happily near homes, along paths, beside manure piles, and in the kind of soil that made other vegetables give up and reconsider their life choices. It didn't need a field. It didn't require a plow. It didn't wait for permission. Good King Henry followed people instead of property lines, which already made it suspicious. Peasants treated it like a dependable neighbor. The leaves were eaten like spinach. The shoots were cooked like asparagus. The seeds could even be ground into flour during desperate times. One plant, multiple meals, minimal effort, medieval efficiency at its finest. And also its downfall. Because here's the issue. Food was supposed to come from land that could be measured, taxed, and threatened. Good King Henry grew in liminal spaces, edges, corners, and forgotten patches of ground where authority was weakest. You couldn't easily regulate it without regulating existence itself. It also thrived year after year. Once established, it came back reliably, offering food without requiring constant labor, and medieval systems preferred constant labor. Labor justified hierarchy. A plant that reduced toil was practically an act of rebellion. To make matters worse, good King Henry had medicinal uses. It soothed digestion, eased inflammation, and generally helped people feel slightly less miserable. Plants that made life easier always attracted suspicion. Comfort, after all, leads to confidence, and confidence, historically, leads to inconvenient questions. So the solution wasn't an outright ban that would have required effort. Instead, good King Henry was slowly rebranded as a weed, something untidy, something uncultured, something respectable people didn't grow on purpose. Once labeled undesirable, it quietly vanished from managed gardens, even as it continued growing stubbornly wherever humans tried to ignore it. Over time, newer crops replaced it, crops that needed careful planting, fertilizing, and oversight, crops that failed spectacularly if neglected, crops that reminded people exactly how dependent they were. Good King Henry didn't fail. It was dismissed. And like many things in medieval history, it didn't disappear because it was bad. It disappeared because it was too good at making life tolerable. Ground nut was the kind of crop that made medieval authorities deeply uneasy, mostly because it was far too clever for its own good. While respectable plants insisted on growing above ground where everyone could see them, ground nut chose secrecy. It climbed politely like a vine on the surface, while quietly producing nutritious tubers underground, hidden, protected, and none of anyone's business. This plant thrived in poor soil, survived drought, and shrugged off pests like they were mild inconveniences. It didn't need fertilizer. It didn't demand irrigation. It didn't require constant supervision, which meant peasants could grow it, harvest it, and eat it without asking for help or approval. Already a red flag. The tubers themselves were rich in protein and calories, which is a dangerous combination when the goal is keeping a population dependent. Grain shortages caused panic. Ground nut reduced panic. Reduced panic led to calm thinking, and calm thinking led to historically inconvenient outcomes. Even worse, ground nuts stored well. It could be harvested discreetly and kept hidden underground until needed. This meant it wasn't always visible during inspections. Medieval officials liked crops they could see. Seeing things made them feel in control. Ground nut laughed quietly beneath the soil. Because the plant climbed rather than sprawled, it didn't look impressive. No dramatic fields, no visible abundance, just a modest vine doing its thing while secretly feeding families through hard seasons. Authorities often dismissed it as insignificant, which only helped it survive longer. But that invisibility was also its downfall. Crops that couldn't be easily counted, couldn't be easily taxed, and anything that interfered with taxation eventually developed a bad reputation. Ground nut became framed as unreliable, wild, or unsuitable for proper farming despite doing an excellent job for centuries. Over time, it was replaced by crops that were easier to monitor and easier to fail. Crops that announced their suffering loudly when conditions weren't perfect. Crops that reminded peasants exactly how fragile their food supply was. Ground nut didn't disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because it was discreet. And in medieval systems of power, discretion was unacceptable. Food was supposed to be visible, measurable, and conveniently vulnerable. Ground nut offered nourishment without spectacle. And that, historically, is how useful things quietly vanish. Sorrel was sharp, sour, and unapologetically honest, which already made it a problem. Its lemony bite cut straight through the endless medieval diet of bread, porridge, and quiet despair. One taste and your mouth woke up. Your stew improved, and for a brief moment, you remembered that food could do more than simply keep you alive. Naturally, this was unsettling. Sorrel grew everywhere: fields, meadows, woodland, edges, roadsides. If the soil existed, sorrel considered it a suggestion rather than a requirement. It thrived in poor conditions, survived frost, and came back year after year with the confidence of a plant that knew no one could stop it. Medieval peasants loved it because it made terrible food tolerable and bad food edible. It also did something far more dangerous. It made spoiled food safer. Sorrel's acidity helped preserve meals and masks unpleasant flavors. When meat was questionable, sorrel helped. When milk was turning, sorrel helped. When bread was old enough to have opinions, sorrel helped. This reduced waste, reduced illness, and reduced reliance on official food supplies, which again was not the goal. Medieval medical texts praised sorrel for cooling the body, easing fevers, and improving digestion. In other words, it made people healthier. Healthy peasants required fewer remedies, fewer pilgrimages, and fewer charitable interventions. Institutions tend to dislike becoming less necessary. Sorrel also grew wild, which meant peasants didn't need fields or permission to gather it, and that was the real issue. Foraging existed in a gray area of medieval law, tolerated when hunger was extreme, discouraged when order needed reinforcing. A plant that fed people without rent or oversight made that gray area uncomfortably large, so sorrel gained a reputation: too sharp, too acidic, too stimulating. Medieval physicians warned that excessive consumption could imbalance the humors, which was a wonderfully flexible accusation that could be applied to anything inconvenient. If peasants ate too much sorrel, the story went, they might become excitable, or worse, opinionated. Over time, sorrel was quietly pushed to the margins. It wasn't banned outright. It was reframed as rustic, excessive, or medicinal rather than culinary. Something you used sparingly, if at all. Something associated with hard times rather than everyday life. But sorrel never truly left. It lingered in hedge, crept back into pots during lean years, and reminded people that flavor, resilience, and survival often grow together. Sorrel didn't disappear because it was harsh. It disappeared because it made bad conditions easier to endure, and history has never been particularly fond of that. Cardone looked like a plant that had lost an argument with civilization and decided to grow anyway. Tall, spiky, and aggressively uninviting. It resembled something you'd expect guarding a fortress rather than feeding a family, which ironically is exactly why it worked so well. Cardon was related to the artichoke, but far tougher and far less interested in being liked. It thrived in poor soil, tolerated drought, ignored pests, and grew into massive plants that produced edible stalks and leaves for months. It didn't need pampering. It didn't need fertilizer. It didn't even need encouragement. It just expanded, unapologetically occupying space like it had tenure. Peasants appreciated this. Cardon provided food when other vegetables failed, especially in dry regions where respectable crops gave up immediately. It stored well, cooked well, and fed entire households with minimal labor. It was, in every sense, inconveniently effective. Authorities, however, saw something else: chaos. Cardon didn't grow neatly. It didn't respect boundaries. It didn't look civilized. Medieval agriculture preferred plants that stayed in rows, behaved predictably, and visually reinforced the idea that humans were in control. Cardon did none of that. It looked wild, even when intentionally cultivated, which made it deeply unsettling to anyone invested in order. Its size was another problem. Large plants signaled abundance, and abundance in peasant hands made elites uncomfortable. A field of wheat could fail and remind people who controlled grain. A patch of cardon kept feeding people, regardless of weather, which was frankly rude. There was also the matter of aesthetics. Medieval elites valued refinement, and cardon was anything but refined. It required preparation, peeling, patience, skills peasants had in abundance. Dismissing it as coarse and unpleasant was easier than admitting it was reliable. So, cardon slowly fell out of favor. It wasn't banned outright. It was ignored, replaced by crops that were easier to manage, easier to fail, and easier to justify controlling. Over time, cardon became something odd, exotic, or forgotten, despite once being a staple. But cardon never cared about approval. It continued growing wherever it could, spines out, leaves wide, quietly reminding the world that resilience doesn't need elegance. Cardon wasn't removed because it was dangerous. It was removed because it didn't behave. And history has always preferred plants and people that stay in line. Rampion was a plant that specialized in doing well where expectations were low. Rocky soil, thin earth, neglected fields. Rampion saw these not as obstacles, but as suggestions. While more delicate crops demanded rich land and constant attention, Rampion quietly grew in places that medieval farmers had already written off as useless. Naturally, peasants noticed. Rampion produced edible roots and leaves, which already made it suspiciously generous. One plant, two food sources, minimal labor. In medieval agriculture, generosity without effort raised eyebrows. Rampion didn't need fertilizer. It didn't collapse during bad weather. It simply persisted, feeding people in marginal lands where authorities had little interest or control. This independence was the real issue. Rampion allowed communities to survive on land that wasn't closely monitored, taxed, or even claimed. Thrived on edges, literal and political. When people could feed themselves on forgotten hillsides, the entire structure of controlled food production started looking optional. Rampion also required patience rather than constant toil. You planted it, waited, and harvested when ready. This meant peasants weren't endlessly visible in fields under watchful eyes. Medieval systems valued visibility. If people were out of sight, they might be thinking, and thinking historically leads to trouble. There was also the problem of symbolism. Rampion became associated with rural independence and folk culture. Songs, stories, and regional dishes celebrated it. Anything that encouraged identity outside centralized authority was viewed with mild alarm. Cultural confidence is a gateway to inconvenient opinions. So Rampion was reframed. It became rustic, coarse, and eventually obsolete. New crops promised higher yields with higher dependency. Rampion was quietly sidelined, not because it failed, but because it didn't fit the narrative of progress. Later, stories would remember Rampion in fairy tales. Always a warning sign. Eat Rampion and consequences follow. A plant that fed the poor quietly transformed into a moral lesson about knowing your place. Very subtle, very effective. Rampion faded from fields and tables, replaced by crops that required better land, better tools, and better oversight. Crops that reminded people who controlled survival. But Rampion still grows in forgotten places, just as it always has. Waiting, thriving, unimpressed. Rampion didn't disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because it made marginal land matter. And that has always been uncomfortable for systems built on scarcity. Alexander's roots were once everywhere, which is exactly why almost no one remembers them now. Before carrots took over medieval kitchens and marched confidently into modern supermarkets, Alexander's roots quietly did the same job, only with less fanfare and more competence. This plant thrived in poor soil, tolerated cold, and required very little care. Its roots were edible, its leaves were useful, and it showed an irritating willingness to grow wherever people didn't want to think too hard about agriculture. In other words, it worked. Alexander's roots were common in monastery gardens, village plots, and roadside edges. They fed people reliably, without demanding endless labor, which again presented a problem. Crops that behave too well reduce urgency, and urgency is the backbone of control. Carrots, on the other hand, were far more dramatic. They needed better soil, better care, and more attention. They responded beautifully to selective breeding, which meant authorities could standardize them, control seed stock, and measure yields. Alexander's roots refused to participate in this vision. They didn't uniform themselves. They didn't improve on command. They simply stayed useful. Naturally, usefulness without obedience was unacceptable. Alexander's roots also suffered from branding. They were old, familiar, associated with the countryside rather than progress. As carrots became fashionable, Alexander's roots were framed as outdated, something your grandparents ate when things were bad. No decree required. Social pressure did the work quietly and efficiently. Medical texts still praised Alexander's roots for digestion and nourishment, but culinary fashion moved on. And once a food is no longer fashionable, it becomes expendable. History has an excellent track record of forgetting things that don't market well. Over time, Alexander's roots were pushed aside by crops that looked brighter, cleaner, and more controllable. Crops that fit neatly into rows and economic plans. Crops that could fail loudly when systems demanded compliance. Alexander's roots didn't fail, they were replaced. And replacement in history is often the polite version of removal. Today, Alexander's roots survive mostly as footnotes, reminders that resilience doesn't always win against aesthetics, and that the strongest plants are often the first to be forgotten. Borage was the kind of plant that did too much and asked for too little in return. It healed wounds, lifted spirits, attracted pollinators, improved soil, and politely reseeded itself without requiring supervision. In medieval agriculture, that level of cooperation was considered suspicious. Borage grew quickly and happily in poor soil. It didn't complain about drought. It didn't sulk during cold snaps. It produced edible leaves and flowers while quietly supporting nearby crops. Farmers noticed that fields with barrage seemed healthier, more productive, and oddly less dramatic, which was not the medieval farming experience anyone was aiming for. Medical texts adored barrage. It was praised for strengthening the heart, calming the spirit, and improving courage. A bold claim, but medieval medicine was nothing if not optimistic. Barrage, teas, picases, and infusions reduced dependence on expensive remedies, which again made institutions slightly uneasy. If people healed themselves, what was everyone else for? Barrage also attracted bees and beneficial insects, boosting pollination naturally. It did what modern agriculture tries to replicate with entire industries, quietly for free. That sort of efficiency tends to make systems nervous. Then there was the cultural problem. Borage became associated with emotional well-being. It was said to chase away melancholy and promote happiness. Now medieval authorities tolerated sadness. Sadness was manageable. Happiness, however, made people relaxed. Relaxed people asked questions. So borage was gently pushed aside. It wasn't banned outright. It was reframed as ornamental, medicinal, or optional. Something nice to have but not essential. Once a plant is labeled non-essential, it becomes easy to forget. As fields shifted toward crops that required fertilizer, rotation, and constant oversight, barrage quietly disappeared from the center of agriculture. It survived in gardens, edges, and memory, just not where it could make a real difference. But barrage never stopped doing what it does best. It still grows willingly. It still feeds insects. It still heals soil. It still reminds us that cooperation with nature is possible and deeply inconvenient for systems built on struggle. Barrage didn't vanish because it failed. It vanished because it solved problems too gently. And history rarely remembers gentle solutions. Mallow was the medieval equivalent of that one neighbor who somehow survives every crisis with a calm smile in a pot of soup. Famine, mallow, illness, mallow, crop failure, also mow. It grew everywhere, helped with almost everything, and asked for nothing in return, which immediately made it suspicious. Mallow thrived in poor soil, along roadsides, near homes, and in abandoned plots where other crops refused to cooperate. Its leaves, roots, and flowers were all edible. That alone was excessive. Medieval food systems preferred specialization. One plant, one use, one tax category. Mallow ignored all of that and simply fed people in multiple ways. It was also medicinal, which never helped its reputation. Mallow soothed sore throats, eased digestive trouble, calmed inflammation, and generally reduced the number of reasons people needed to seek help from official healers. A plant that replaced both food and medicine blurred lines. Authorities preferred to keep very sharp. Even worse, mallow was gentle. Its texture softened stews, thickened broths, and made otherwise bleak meals feel intentional. Comfort is dangerous. Comfort makes people feel stable. Stable people do not panic appropriately. Mallow was especially valuable during lean years. When grain stores ran low and fields failed, mallow appeared anyway, quietly filling the gap. It turned forgotten patches of land into emergency kitchens. From an administrative perspective, this was a nightmare. Hunger was meant to be a pressure point. Mallow relieved pressure. So mallow was dismissed as a weed, an unremarkable plant, something common, boring, and unworthy of attention. This was not an accident. Labeling something common is an excellent way to remove it from serious consideration without explaining why. Medical writers continued to praise mallow quietly, but official agriculture moved on to crops that demanded more work, more planning, and more oversight. Crops that failed loudly when neglected. Crops that reminded people how fragile survival was supposed to be. Mallow remained, of course, it always does. It grows in the margins, appears during hard times, and vanishes again when systems regain control. It doesn't protest, it doesn't argue, it waits. Mallow didn't disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because it was forgiving. And forgiving solutions have a habit of undermining very strict systems. See, kale grew in places medieval agriculture politely ignored. Wind-blasted coastlines, pebbled beaches, salty soil that laughed at respectable crops. Where wheat failed immediately and barley gave up out of spite, sea kale stood firm, leaves thick, roots deep, entirely unbothered by conditions that would send other vegetables into an existential crisis. It required no fertilizer. It tolerated salt spray. It survived storms, drought, and neglect. In other words, it refused to participate in the drama that made farming controllable. Coastal communities relied on sea kale heavily. It provided fresh greens when inland crops failed, and it returned every year without complaint. You didn't plow for it. You didn't rotate fields. You didn't beg the weather. You harvested and moved on with your life, which was precisely the problem. Sea kale bypassed the inland food hierarchy entirely. It grew outside managed farmland, beyond easy taxation, beyond routine oversight. Lords controlled fields. They controlled barns. They controlled grain. They did not control beaches, and anything that fed people outside official systems was viewed as suspiciously convenient. There was also the matter of storage and strength. Sea kale was tough. Its thick leaves resisted pests and rot. Its roots anchored it so firmly that storms often failed to uproot it. Resilience of this kind undermined the medieval belief that nature needed constant domination. Sea kale didn't want domination. It wanted space. Authorities never banned it outright. That would have required acknowledging its value. Instead, it was framed as wild, rough, and inferior to proper vegetables. Something coastal people ate because they had no better options. This narrative worked quietly and effectively. As inland agriculture expanded and trade networks grew, sea kale was replaced by vegetables that could be standardized, transported, and marketed more easily. Crops that depended on infrastructure, crops that failed when systems failed. Sea kale asked for nothing except to be left alone. Over time, it retreated to the edges. Dunes, cliffs, forgotten shores. Still growing, still edible, still doing exactly what it had always done. It didn't vanish. It was simply ignored until it became invisible. Sea kale didn't disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because it grew where authority could not follow. And history has always struggled with things that thrive beyond its reach. Asparagus pear had a deeply confusing identity which did not help its long-term survival. It wasn't asparagus. It wasn't really a pea. It tasted faintly of asparagus when young produced edible pods later, and generally refused to commit to a single role. Medieval agriculture liked clarity. Asparagus pea offered versatility, and that made everyone nervous. This plant thrived in poor soil, tolerated heat, resisted pests, and required minimal care. It grew happily where other vegetables sulked, producing edible shoots and pods over a long season. In other words, it did far too much while asking far too little. Peasants valued asparagus pea because it filled gaps. When one crop failed, it didn't. When food stores thinned, it helped. When labor was limited, it politely carried on without complaint. But systems built on control prefer predictability, not resilience. Asparagus pea also stored reasonably well and could be harvested in stages. That meant food availability wasn't concentrated in one dramatic moment. No panic, no scarcity spike, just steady nourishment, which administrators historically find unsettling. Even worse, asparagus pea didn't require heavy tilling or strict planting schedules. It didn't fit neatly into rotational farming systems designed around grain dominance. Anything that disrupts the centrality of grain is immediately suspect. Over time, asparagus pea was quietly edged out by crops that offered higher yields in exchange for higher dependence. Crops that needed better soil, better tools, and better timing. Crops that reminded farmers exactly how fragile their survival was. Asparagus pea was reframed as odd, old-fashioned, or simply unnecessary. It wasn't fashionable. It didn't scale well. It didn't photograph nicely for medieval cookbooks, a tragically overlooked market. But in its quiet way, asparagus pea had been doing something remarkable. Smoothing out food supply shocks, making hunger less dramatic, reducing reliance on centralized stores. And history, as we've seen, prefers hunger dramatic. Asparagus pea didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it refused to be essential in only one way. Versatility is powerful, and power that cannot be neatly categorized rarely lasts. Chickweed suffered from the worst branding problem in agricultural history: its name. If you call something a weed long enough, people stop asking whether it might actually be food. And chickweed was very much food, nutritious, abundant, and irritatingly reliable, which made the name extremely convenient for everyone in charge. Chickweed grew everywhere, not figuratively, literally everywhere. Fields, gardens, roadsides, cracks in walls, abandoned lots, places no one had officially approved for life. It sprouted quickly, spread generously, and stayed tender and edible for most of the year. While other vegetables demanded planning, chickweed simply showed up like a friend who brings snacks without being asked. Nutritionally, chickweed was embarrassing. It contained vitamins, minerals, and enough nourishment to matter, especially during early spring when stored food was running low and hope was a limited resource. It filled the seasonal hunger gap quietly, without ceremony, and without paperwork, which of course was the problem. Chickweed didn't belong to anyone. It didn't require fields, fences, or tools. It grew where authority was weakest and oversight was minimal. Peasants could gather it freely, which meant they could eat without buying, borrowing, or begging. A food that reduced desperation was a threat to systems that relied on it. So chickweed was dismissed, labeled worthless. Something chickens ate, something poor people ate when things were bad. The implication was clear. Respectable people ignored it. Respectable people, historically, are very easy to manipulate. Medical texts quietly acknowledged chickweed's benefits. Healers used it. Villagers knew its value. But official agriculture had no interest in promoting a plant that solved problems without creating dependency. As farming shifted toward crops that required seed control, fertilization, and oversight, chickweed became an inconvenience. You couldn't stop it from growing, but you could stop talking about it. And once something stops being talked about, it effectively disappears. But chickweed never actually left. It kept growing, it kept feeding, it kept thriving in the margins. Even today, it pops up uninvited, reminding us that food doesn't always need permission, and resilience doesn't require innovation, just patience and neglect. Chickweed wasn't removed because it was weak. It was ignored because it was unstoppable. And history, when faced with things it cannot control, prefers to look away. Medieval convents were supposed to be fortresses against desire. High walls, locked gates, barred windows, and a timetable so strict it left little room for thinking, let alone sin. On parchment, it all looked wonderfully airtight. Bishops loved to imagine convents as perfectly sealed jars of holiness where women floated through life on prayer, silence, and thin soup. Reality, unfortunately, had a habit of picking the lock. Most nuns did not arrive because they felt an overwhelming spiritual calling. Many were placed there by families making cold, practical decisions. Noble households sent spare daughters to convents to avoid splitting estates. Merchant families saw convents as cheaper than dowries. Peasant girls were sometimes offered up simply because there was not enough food to go around. Once the door closed behind them, these women were expected to live out a vow they had barely chosen for decades, until death politely intervened. Life inside a convent was repetitive to the point of madness. The same prayers, the same corridors, the same faces, day after day, year after year. Silence was enforced, but silence does not erase emotion. It amplifies it. Affection, jealousy, boredom, loneliness, and curiosity had nowhere to go. They did not vanish, they pulled, and eventually they found cracks. Convents were also not as isolated as church authorities liked to claim. Confessors came and went. Priests heard sins in private rooms. Male laborers repaired roofs, dug gardens, and delivered supplies. Messengers carried letters in and out. Some convents sat directly inside towns, sharing walls with ordinary homes. Others had hidden doors, back corridors, or poorly guarded gates used for errands. The idea that no man ever crossed into this world is a comforting fantasy, not a historical one. The Church knew this. Church records are filled with anxious warnings, repeated reforms, and increasingly strict rules that read like someone trying to plug a leaking dam with their fingers. When rules multiply, it is usually because people are ignoring them. And they were not always dramatically, not always scandalously, but often enough to worry bishops who understood one thing very well. A vow made without choice is a fragile thing. This tension between holy expectation and human reality set the stage for everything that followed. Forbidden relationships did not erupt because convents were immoral spaces. They happened because convents were human spaces, built on an ideal that ignored how stubborn desire can be when locked behind stone walls. When outside contact was limited, emotion had a habit of folding back on itself. Medieval convents were overwhelmingly female spaces filled with women who ate together, worked together, slept under the same roof, and shared their lives with almost no interruption. Intimacy was unavoidable. The Church encouraged spiritual sisterhood, but it rarely paused to define where spiritual closeness ended and something else quietly began. Friendships between nuns could be intense. Letters and convent rules speak of particular friendships, a phrase church officials used when concern crept into their tone. These were not casual bonds. Some pairs insisted on sitting together, working together, praying side by side, and becoming visibly distressed when separated. Abbesses were warned to break up such attachments, not because they were disruptive to discipline, but because they were believed to lead the heart astray. Church writers struggled to describe what they feared without admitting it outright. They warned against excessive touching, shared beds, whispered conversations after lights out, and gifts exchanged in secret. These warnings exist for a reason. Where rules appear repeatedly, behavior is rarely imaginary. In convents, where warmth and affection were scarce commodities, emotional hunger found willing partners. Not all intimacy was sexual, but medieval authorities often assumed it could become so. Emotional bonds were dangerous precisely because they felt harmless at first. Comfort during illness turned into dependency. Shared grief turned into exclusivity. In a world that denied romantic attachment entirely, even small gestures could carry enormous weight. A hand held too long, a private nickname, a glance understood only by two people could feel like rebellion. Punishments varied widely. Some abbessones chose discretion, separating the women quietly and assigning different duties. Others imposed fasting, isolation, or public penance. A few cases escalated to ecclesiastical courts, where records speak in careful, evasive language that avoids explicit detail while making the implication clear enough. The Church preferred correction over spectacle, especially when no men were involved, and scandal could be contained within the walls. What makes these relationships striking is not their rarity, but their predictability. Remove men, forbid marriage, enforce silence, and demand lifelong celibacy, and affection does not die, it adapts. Medieval convents did not eliminate desire, they redirected it inward, creating bonds so strong that the Church itself worried they might rival devotion to God if stone walls could be crossed. Paper slipped through them even more easily. Letters were the quiet bloodstream of medieval convent life, officially tolerated and carefully regulated, yet endlessly abused. Nuns were permitted to write to family, patrons, and church officials, but correspondence required approval, supervision, and ideally, complete innocence. What the rules allowed and what actually happened were two very different things. Some letters were harmless enough at first glance: polite greetings, updates on health, prayers promised in exchange for donations. But hidden beneath respectful language, writers learned to embed meaning. Phrases about longing for spiritual guidance, gratitude for past kindness, or concern for a correspondent soul could easily double as emotional confession. Medieval readers were trained to write indirectly, and nuns became especially skilled at it. When passion could not be named, it learned to whisper. Surviving letters reveal language that feels uncomfortably intimate. Writers spoke of aching hearts, unbearable absence, sleepless nights, and joy at the thought of reunion. Some promised eternal remembrance. Others begged for replies with an urgency that went far beyond polite correspondence. Church authorities noticed. Bishops complained that letters from convents sounded more like love poetry than spiritual reflection, and warned confessors to monitor them closely. Smuggling letters was rarely difficult. Messengers, servants, visiting priests, and even sympathetic family members acted as couriers. In some cases, letters were hidden in baskets of food or sewn into clothing. A few convents developed informal networks where trusted individuals ensured messages traveled safely in both directions. Once writing began, it often escalated. Letters invited replies, replies encouraged meetings, and meetings turned rumor into risk. When discovered, letters were dangerous evidence. Unlike fleeting glances or whispered words, they could be read aloud, copied, and preserved. Abbesses were instructed to confiscate suspicious correspondence and report it to superiors. Some letters were burned immediately to prevent scandal. Others survived precisely because they were seized and filed as proof of wrongdoing. Ironically, the very effort to suppress them ensured their survival. Punishments, again, varied. Writers might be confined, forced into silence, or transferred to stricter houses. In more serious cases, entire convents fell under suspicion, leading to inspections and reforms. Letters exposed not just individual desire, but institutional vulnerability. They showed that enclosure was never absolute, and that emotional bonds could stretch far beyond the walls meant to contain them. In the end, these letters remind us that medieval nuns were not silent figures, frozen in prayer. They were articulate, literate women who used the tools available to them. Ink became their quiet rebellion, carrying forbidden affection where footsteps could not go. If letters slipped quietly through convent walls, confessors walked straight through the front door with full church approval. Priests were essential to convent life. They heard confessions, celebrated mass, delivered sermons, and provided spiritual guidance. In theory, they were neutral instruments of God. In reality, they were human men, placed in positions of extraordinary emotional authority over women who had been trained to obey. Confession was meant to purify the soul, but it also created intimacy. A nun spoke alone, often behind a screen, revealing her fears, doubts, and temptations to a man sworn to secrecy. Over time, some confessors became more than spiritual advisors. They became confident, emotional anchors, and, in certain cases, objects of affection. Church writers warned repeatedly that private confession created dangerous familiarity, especially when conducted too frequently or without supervision. The danger worked both ways. Some priests abused their authority, manipulating devotion into dependence. They framed affection as spiritual guidance, or claimed that special bonds were signs of divine favor. Others convinced nuns that obedience to them was obedience to God Himself. Medieval church records contain uncomfortable phrases like excessive familiarity and inappropriate consolation, carefully chosen to avoid saying outright what everyone understood. Not every case involved coercion. Some relationships developed slowly, shaped by shared belief, conversation, and emotional vulnerability. A confessor who listened, encouraged, and praised could feel like a lifeline in an enclosed world. For a priest, admiration from a learned, attentive audience may have felt equally intoxicating. When boundaries blurred, both sides risked ruin. The church responded with rules that read like damage control. Confessors were rotated frequently. Some convents required 2 nuns to be present during spiritual discussions. Others limited how often a priest could visit or ban private meetings altogether. These measures were not theoretical. They were reactions to repeated scandals that refused to disappear. When relationships were uncovered, consequences were severe. Priests could be stripped of office, reassigned, or imprisoned in monasteries. Nuns faced penance, isolation, or transferred to harsher houses. In extreme cases, entire convents were accused of corruption, leading to inspections that turned spiritual homes into crime scenes. What made these relationships especially troubling to church authorities was not just sexual misconduct, but the collapse of hierarchy. A confessor crossing boundaries threatened the very structure of obedience on which convent life depended. The thin line between guidance and control proved easier to cross than the church ever wanted to admit. For church officials, rumors of affection could be managed. Letters could be burned, friendships broken up, priests reassigned. Children, however, were far harder to explain away. And yet, medieval records make it painfully clear that pregnancies did occur inside convent walls. Rare, carefully concealed, but devastating when discovered. A pregnant nun represented undeniable proof that enclosure had failed. The question was not only how it happened, but how many people must have known. Concealment required cooperation. Fellow nuns, servants, midwives, and sometimes even abbesses became silent participants. Loose habits, restricted movement, and claims of illness bought time. In some cases, childbirth happened in secrecy at night, with trusted helpers sworn to silence. What happened to the children depended entirely on circumstance. Some infants were quietly sent away to be raised by relatives, placed with sympathetic families, or abandoned at foundling hospitals. Others disappeared from the record entirely, leaving historians to suspect outcomes that were never written down. A few convents developed disturbingly efficient systems for removing evidence before it could reach church authorities. When pregnancies were exposed, punishment could be brutal. Nuns were interrogated, often under intense pressure to name accomplices. Fathers, if identified, faced their own penalties, though records show women bore the heavier burden of shame. Some nuns were expelled and forced into public penance. Others were locked into stricter convents, their lives reduced to silence and isolation. In extreme cases, ecclesiastical courts imposed lifelong imprisonment. The church publicly framed these cases as moral collapse. But the responses reveal something more complicated. Authorities were often reluctant to expose scandal fully. Bishops weighed punishment against reputation, choosing secrecy when public outrage threatened donations or political support. Quiet resolutions were preferred. Justice was negotiable. Appearances were not. These hidden children exposed the contradiction at the heart of medieval convent life. Celibacy was demanded, but choice was often absent. Surveillance was strict, but never absolute. Women were blamed, yet systems quietly adjusted to protect institutions rather than individuals. The convent did not simply fail these women. It absorbed their mistakes and erased them behind stone walls built to separate holiness from flesh. Life continued to assert itself. Crying infants, hastily arranged removals, and rewritten records all testify to a truth the church struggled to control. Vows could be enforced, but biology and emotion were far less obedient. Medieval convents were described as sealed spaces, but archaeology and records tell a more inconvenient story. Enclosure looked impressive from the outside, yet it relied on human discipline rather than physical impossibility. And humans, being what they are, built loopholes into stone. Many convents contained secondary entrances meant for practical use. Food deliveries, waste removal, repairs, and medical emergencies required access points beyond the main gate. Over time, these doors became routine, then invisible, then quietly exploited. A back door used once a week became a door no one questioned. A key held for emergencies became a key held permanently. Perfect enclosure existed mostly in sermons. Some convents shared walls with surrounding towns. Windows opened onto streets, roofs connected to neighboring buildings. In a few documented cases, passages and tunnels existed beneath convents, originally built for drainage, storage, or escape during sieges. Later, Rumor claimed they served more interesting purposes. While not every tale of secret tunnels is true, enough physical evidence survives to confirm that some convents were far more porous than their rules suggested. Servants played a crucial role. Unlike nuns, they were not cloistered for life. They moved between convent and town, carrying messages, supplies, and gossip. Trust in servants was necessary, but trust created opportunity. A discreet servant could arrange meetings, pass letters, or simply look the other way. Silence had a price, and medieval society was very good at informal transactions. Abbesses were often aware of these weaknesses. Some fought relentlessly to enforce discipline, sealing doors, rotating staff, and reporting suspicions upward. Others chose pragmatism. They knew that rigid enforcement could provoke rebellion or attract unwanted scrutiny. A controlled leak was sometimes preferable to an explosion. As long as scandals remained quiet, order was considered intact. When church inspectors arrived, convents transformed. Suspicious doors were bricked up temporarily. Routines were tightened. Nuns were coached on what to say and what to forget. Inspections were announced in advance, more often than not, giving communities time to prepare. This was not corruption so much as institutional survival. The myth of perfect enclosure mattered because it protected authority. If convent walls were truly impenetrable, then any scandal could be blamed on individual sin. Admitting structural flaws would mean admitting that the system itself was unrealistic. And so the church clung to the image of sealed holiness, even as doors quietly opened and closed behind it. Stone walls can stop footsteps. They cannot stop intention. Medieval convents were not breached by dramatic escapes or daring lovers, but by small compromises repeated until enclosure became an idea rather than a reality. When forbidden relationships came to light, the church faced a dilemma. Public punishment reinforced moral authority, but public scandal damaged reputations, donations, and political ties. The solution was often selective justice, harsh enough to deter, quiet enough to contain. Medieval discipline was less about fairness and more about control. Minor infractions were usually handled internally. A nun accused of inappropriate closeness might be reassigned, isolated, or subjected to fasting and extra prayers. Silence was a favored tool. Being forbidden to speak, sing, or participate in communal life could last months or years. In a world built on shared ritual, silence was not mild punishment. It was erasure. More serious cases triggered ecclesiastical courts. These proceedings were deliberately opaque. Records use vague language like grave misconduct or violation of chastity, avoiding explicit detail. The goal was not truth for its own sake, but the restoration of order. Confessions were extracted, penance assigned, and documentation sealed away. Justice happened behind closed doors, just like the offenses themselves. Status mattered enormously. A well-connected convent with noble patrons often received gentler treatment than a poor rural house. Influential families could intervene, requesting transfers instead of expeditious abysses from powerful lineages negotiated directly with bishops. Meanwhile, lower-status nuns faced harsher outcomes, sometimes becoming convenient examples of moral decay. Men, when involved, were punished differently. Priests might be reassigned, quietly disciplined, or sent to another monastery. Public disgrace was rare unless the scandal had already escaped containment. Women bore the visible consequences. Their bodies provided evidence. Their reputations were easier to sacrifice. The imbalance was neither accidental nor hidden, or silence extended beyond punishment. Witnesses were discouraged from speaking. Letters were destroyed. Children were removed. Memories were managed. The goal was not only to stop behavior, but to eliminate narrative. A scandal forgotten was a scandal resolved. Ironically, this culture of silence made repetition more likely. Without open acknowledgement, patterns went unexamined. Reforms addressed symptoms rather than causes. Rules multiplied. Surveillance increased. Yet the underlying pressures remained unchanged. Punishment in medieval convents was less about morality than maintenance. The church did not need perfect purity, it needed plausible purity. As long as walls appeared intact and voices stayed quiet, the system could continue. Those who broke that silence paid the price, not for what they did alone, but for what their exposure threatened to reveal. Every major scandal sparked reform. New rules were written, inspections intensified, and sermons thundered about discipline and decay. From the outside, it looked like decisive action. From inside the convents, it felt like déjà vu. Reform did not remove desire, it merely forced it to adapt. The church repeatedly tightened enclosure. Grills were reinforced, windows were screened, visiting hours were shortened, confessors were rotated more frequently. Yet each reform revealed the same uncomfortable truth. The system depended on constant vigilance, and constant vigilance eventually failed. Human fatigue proved more reliable than divine regulation. Some convents collapsed entirely under scandal. When accusations multiplied or evidence became impossible to bury, houses were dissolved. Nuns were scattered to other institutions, their community erased as if it had never existed. Official explanations spoke of corruption or spiritual weakness, never structural failure. Blame stayed safely individual. Other scandals escaped into popular imagination. Ballads, rumors, and satirical stories circulated about lustful nuns, secret lovers, and midnight meetings. These tales often exaggerated reality, but their persistence mattered. They reflected widespread awareness that convents were not the sealed sanctuaries the church claimed. The public knew, the clergy knew, the public knew. Everyone pretended otherwise. Ironically, these stories hardened expectations. Nuns were increasingly viewed with suspicion, and stricter rules were justified by the assumption that temptation was everywhere. Women paid the price for reputations they did not individually earn. Innocence became irrelevant. Surveillance replaced trust. Reformers within the church occasionally acknowledged deeper problems. Some argued that forced vocations were the root cause. Others questioned lifelong vows imposed on teenagers. These voices rarely won. Convents remained convenient solutions for family politics, inheritance management, and social order. The institution persisted because it was useful, not because it was humane. By the late Middle Ages, cracks were impossible to ignore. Calls for change echoed beyond convent walls, feeding broader critiques of church authority. When the Reformation arrived, convent scandals were eagerly weaponized as proof of systemic hypocrisy. Stories once whispered became public ammunition. Reform failed because it addressed behavior without addressing consent. It treated desire as disobedience rather than inevitability. Medieval convents were not uniquely corrupt spaces. They were pressure chambers built to suppress human needs without release. Scandal did not destroy convents overnight, but it weakened the illusion holding them together. And once that illusion cracked, it never fully recovered. By the end of the Middle Ages, the story of forbidden relationships in convents had become impossible to fully suppress. Not because every convent was corrupt, but because the gap between ideal and reality was finally too visible. The church continued to insist that enclosure worked in principle, even as centuries of evidence suggested otherwise. The walls remained. The illusion did not. What emerges most clearly from the records is not scandal, but humanity. Medieval nuns were not symbols. They were women with limited choices, placed into lifelong vows, often before they fully understood them. Some adapted with genuine faith. Others struggled quietly. A few sought connection wherever it could be found. Their actions were not unique or shocking by modern standards. What made them explosive was the system surrounding them. The church framed forbidden relationships as moral failure, but history suggests structural strain. Convents concentrated young people, removed choice, suppressed sexuality, enforced silence, and demanded perfection. When cracks appeared, blame fell downward. Institutions survived by absorbing guilt into individuals, then erasing them from the narrative. Ironically, the very effort to hide these stories ensured their survival. Court records, reformed decrees, confiscated letters, and disciplinary manuals preserved what sermons tried to deny. Historians do not uncover these relationships by accident. They exist because the Church documented them obsessively, trying to control what it could not prevent. These stories, also, explain why convents fascinated and unsettled medieval society. They represented purity under pressure, holiness under surveillance. When they failed, even quietly, it unsettled the broader belief that strict rules could remake human nature. The problem was never desire alone. It was the belief that desire could be sealed away indefinitely. In later centuries, reforms softened some extremes. Forced vocations declined. Education and choice slowly increased. But the medieval experiment left its mark. It revealed the cost of treating obedience as virtue without consent and silence as proof of holiness. The walls of medieval convents were real. The vows were real. The expectations were real. What was never real was the idea that human connection could be eliminated by stone and rules. Behind every locked gate lived people negotiating faith, fear, affection, and survival. Forbidden relationships were not the story of convicts, they were the symptom. The real story is what happens when institutions demand perfection from humans, then punish them for being exactly what they are. In a medieval convent, a vow was not a personal spiritual commitment. It was a public contract, spoken aloud, witnessed by church officials, recorded by scribes, and enforced by an institution that understood vows as structural pillars. When a nun broke one, especially chastity, obedience, or enclosure, it was not treated as a moment of weakness. It was treated as a threat. Convents survived on reputation, donations, protection from local lords, and favor from bishops depended on the belief that these were sealed spaces of discipline and purity. One broken vow suggested that the walls were not working, that the rules were failing, and that authority was slipping. This is why punishment was rarely quiet or gentle. Discipline was designed not just to correct the individual, but to reassure everyone else that control still existed. Unlike secular law, convent discipline operated without juries, lawyers, or appeals. Abbesses had wide authority. Bishops had more. Accusations did not require proof beyond suspicion, rumor, or confession extracted under pressure. Once guilt was assumed, punishment followed quickly. The goal was speed, containment, and example. Even minor offenses could escalate. Excessive laughter, private conversations, refusal to obey orders, or emotional attachment could all be interpreted as early signs of moral decay. The logic was preventative. Better to punish early than allow corruption to spread. A nun did not need to commit a scandal to be disciplined. She only needed to make superiors nervous. What made convent punishment particularly severe was its permanence. Secular punishments ended, fines were paid, prison terms expired. But convent discipline often reshaped an entire life. A woman punished inside the church rarely returned to normal standing. Her reputation within the convent was marked. Her movements were restricted. Her future was narrowed. The church framed this system as spiritual medicine. Pain was meant to heal the soul. Fear was meant to protect holiness. But the structure reveals another function entirely. Punishment was a tool of maintenance. It preserved hierarchy, silence, and obedience in an environment where consent was often absent. To break a vow was to expose a crack in the system. Punishment existed to seal that crack quickly, even if it meant crushing the person who revealed it. In medieval convents, discipline was not about forgiveness, it was about control. And control was considered sacred. When convent authorities wanted to break a nun without drawing public attention, they turned to isolation. Solitary confinement was one of the most effective and commonly used punishments, precisely because it left no visible marks. A nun could be removed from communal life and effectively erased while still remaining physically inside the convent. Isolation cells varied widely, but few were humane. Some were small rooms at the edge of the convent, others repurposed storage spaces, and some were little more than stone closets. Light was limited, heat was unreliable. In colder regions, Winter confinement could be physically dangerous. A straw mattress, a wooden stool, and a prayer book were often all that remained. Silence was strictly enforced. The punished nun was forbidden to speak except in prayer, and sometimes not even then. Meals were passed through doors or left on the floor. Confession, if allowed, was brief and controlled. Human contact was minimized to the point where days blended into one another. This was not accidental. Medieval discipline understood silence as both penance and pressure. The Church described solitude as spiritually cleansing. Alone with God, the sinner was meant to reflect, repent, and reform. In practice, the effect was often psychological collapse. Nuns accustomed to structured routine and communal worship suddenly faced emptiness. The mind, deprived of stimulation, turned inward. Anxiety, despair, and hallucinations were not uncommon, though rarely recorded as such. Isolation also served a symbolic function. Removing a nun from communal spaces signaled disgrace. Her absence was noticed. Others were reminded that punishment was real, even if details remained unspoken. Silence created mystery, and mystery amplified fear. Duration was flexible. Some confinements lasted weeks, others stretched into months or years. Release depended on perceived obedience, confession, or the judgment of superiors. There was no clear standard. The uncertainty itself became part of the punishment. Unlike secular imprisonment, solitary confinement in convents had no external oversight. No one checked conditions. No one measured damage. The Opus authority was absolute within the walls. A punishment framed as spiritual guidance became an instrument of total control. Isolation did not correct behavior so much as erase resistance. When a nun returned to communal life, she did so, subdued, cautious, and acutely aware of her vulnerability. Silence had done its work. When silence alone was not enough, hunger followed. Food restriction was one of the most visible and humiliating punishments. Available in medieval convents, it required no chains, no cells, and no witnesses beyond the dining hall itself. A nun placed on a bread and water diet carried her punishment on her body. This diet was exactly what it sounds like: dry bread, often coarse and stale, and water, sometimes rationed. No vegetables, no broth, no wine. The punishment could last days, weeks, or far longer, depending on the perceived severity of the offense. In a time when daily meals were already sparse, this reduction pushed the body quickly toward weakness. The purpose was not starvation in the modern sense, it was submission. Hunger sharpened obedience. A hungry nun lacked the strength to resist, argue, or defy authority. The Church framed the diet as imitation of Christ's suffering and a reminder of humility. In reality, it functioned as physical pressure disguised as spiritual exercise. The punishment was often public. While other nuns ate their meals, the punished sister sat apart or received her bread in silence. No one needed an explanation. Everyone understood. Shame did the rest of the work. Hunger isolated just as effectively as confinement, but without removing the body from view. Health consequences were common, especially for younger nuns or those already weakened by illness. Fainting, dizziness, and prolonged weakness were quietly accepted risks. Complaints were interpreted as resistance rather than distress. A body that failed was seen as evidence of guilt, not suffering. Bread and water diets were also used strategically. They could precede confession, accompany interrogation, or follow suspected misconduct, even without proof. Hunger softened resolve. It encouraged repentance that might otherwise remain withheld. In this sense, the diet became a tool of extraction as much as punishment. Unlike secular fasting, convent hunger was compulsory. Refusal only escalated discipline. There was no negotiation, and none could not appeal to family, law, or community. Her body belonged to the rule. By controlling food, convent authorities controlled time, energy, and will. Hunger blurred thought, narrowed focus, and reduced identity to obedience. In medieval convents, discipline did not need violence to be brutal. It only needed patience, bread, and water. When church authorities wanted punishment to be seen, they turned to public penance. Unlike solitary confinement or hunger, this form of discipline relied on visibility. Shame was not a side effect, it was the point. A nun sentenced to public penance was required to perform acts of submission in front of her community. She might kneel during services while others stood, lie prostrate on the stone floor, or confess her fault aloud in vague but unmistakable terms. Sometimes she wore special clothing, a coarse habit, no veil, or a marker of disgrace that separated her visually from the rest of the convent. These rituals were carefully choreographed. They followed a familiar structure of accusation, submission, and conditional forgiveness. The community watched in silence. No comfort was offered. Compassion risked being interpreted as defiance. The message was clear. Obedience was restored through humiliation. Public penance reinforced hierarchy. The upus, or superior, occupied a position of authority. Dispensing mercy after submission was demonstrated. Forgiveness was granted from above, not negotiated. Even when a nun had already suffered confinement or hunger, public penance served as a final confirmation that she had been broken and reintegrated under control. The psychological impact was lasting. Reputation in a convent mattered deeply. Communal life depended on trust, cooperation, and shared ritual. Public humiliation fractured that trust. A punished nun carried her disgrace long after the ritual ended. Glances lingered. Conversations stopped when she approached. Silence followed her through corridors. In theory, public penance was meant to cleanse both sinner and community. In practice, it often reinforced fear. Witnessing punishment reminded every nun that her safety depended on compliance. Even innocent behavior became cautious. Affection was restrained. Speech was measured. The system policed itself through memory. Public penance was also selective. Well-connected convents sometimes minimized it to avoid scandal. Powerful families negotiated discretion. Poorer nuns, lacking protection, were more likely to be made examples of. Justice followed status. By turning discipline into ritual, the church transformed punishment into theater. The body became the stage, shame the lesson, and silence the applause. In medieval convents, public penance did not just correct behavior, it taught everyone watching exactly how fragile their place truly was. When convent authorities decided that a nun could no longer be trusted, but also could not be released, they imposed one of the harshest penalties available: permanent enclosure. This punishment did not involve chains or public spectacle. It was quieter, colder, and far more final. Permanent enclosure meant that a nun remained inside the convent for life, stripped of privileges and freedom within the very space that was supposed to offer refuge. Unlike ordinary cloistered life, this form of enclosure was restrictive, even by monastic standards. Movement was limited. Participation in communal activities was reduced or denied. Contact with others was tightly controlled. Some women were confined to specific wings of the convent, forbidden to enter the choir, refectory, or garden at the same time as others. They prayed alone. They ate alone. They worked alone. The convent remained around them, but they were no longer part of it. This was not exile, it was containment. The logic behind permanent enclosure was simple. Expelling a nun risked scandal. Releasing her into the secular world raised questions. Keeping her inside, hidden and controlled, solved both problems. The institution remained intact. The transgression disappeared from view for the punished nun. The effect was devastating. There was no end date, no promise of restoration. Unlike temporary penance, permanent enclosure offered no narrative of redemption. It assumed failure was irreversible. Life narrowed to routine without community, faith without fellowship. This punishment was especially common in cases involving repeated disobedience, sexual misconduct, or accusations that threatened convent reputation. Whether guilt was proven mattered less than risk. A woman perceived as unstable, defiant, or dangerous to order could be quietly removed from view forever. Church records rarely described the emotional impact. They did not need to. permanent enclosure achieved what discipline sought above all else: silence. The punished woman stopped being a problem because she stopped being visible. Unlike secular imprisonment, permanent enclosure had no legal challenge, no appeal, and no oversight. Once imposed, it was nearly impossible to reverse. A nun could live decades under this sentence, aging behind the same walls that once promised protection. In medieval convents, permanent enclosure was not correction. It was erasure, a life reduced to compliance, not through violence, but through isolation so complete that resistance simply ran out. Expulsion was the punishment reserved for cases the church could no longer contain quietly. Unlike enclosure, which hid failure, expulsion exposed it. To be cast out of a convent was not simply a loss of home. It was a social death sentence. A nun expelled from her house lost protection, identity, and status in a single moment. She was stripped of her habit, sometimes publicly, sometimes behind closed doors, but always symbolically. The habit marked belonging. Without it, she became something dangerous. A woman trained for religious life with no place in the secular world. For many women, expulsion was catastrophic. Families who had placed daughters in convents often did so because they could not support them or did not want them back. Dowries were gone. Marriages were impossible. An expelled nun returned to society carrying suspicion, stigma, and few practical skills beyond prayer, reading, and domestic labor. Survival depended on charity or the mercy of relatives who may have already written her off. The church did not expel lightly. Scandal had to outweigh risk. Sexual misconduct made public. Repeated disobedience or refusal to submit to discipline could push authorities to this extreme. Sometimes expulsion followed failed attempts at confinement or penance. Sometimes it was immediate, decisive, and unforgiving. Ironically, expulsion was also a way to protect institutions. Removing a problematic nun shifted blame onto the individual. The convent remained pure. The system remained sound. The expelled woman became the story, not the structure that shaped her. Some expelled nuns disappeared into poverty. Others entered informal religious communities or attached themselves to hospitals, beganages, or households willing to overlook their past. A few reinvented themselves entirely, but the record is mostly silent. Expulsion erased people from history as effectively as enclosure erased them from sight. Unlike secular punishment, there was no path back, no rehabilitation, no restoration of status. Once expelled, a woman existed outside both church and society, belonging fully to neither. Expulsion revealed the limits of medieval mercy. When discipline failed, compassion ended. The convent closed its doors, and with them any obligation to the life it had helped shape. In medieval convents, expulsion was not just punishment. It was abandonment, sanctified by authority and sealed by silence. When vows were broken, punishment was rarely shared equally. The church spoke endlessly about sin, but discipline followed hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, nuns almost always paid more than the men involved. If a relationship involved a priest, confessor, or cleric, consequences diverged sharply. Men were often reassigned, quietly transferred to another parish or monastery, or subjected to mild penance that left their careers intact. Their authority was framed as compromised, not their character. A change of location solved the problem. Silence finished the job. Nuns had no such escape. Their bodies were evidence. Pregnancy, reputation, and confinement made their guilt visible in ways male transgressions never were. Even when coercion was suspected, responsibility fell downward. Church records speak of seduced nuns far less often than fallen women, language that erased power imbalance while preserving male authority. This imbalance was structural, not accidental. Clergy were assets. They administered sacraments, maintained parishes, and upheld church operations. Nuns, by contrast, were contained dependents. Their value lay in obedience and invisibility. When conflict arose, institutions protected what they needed most. Punishment also reflected assumptions about temptation. Church writers routinely portrayed women as morally weaker, more emotional, more susceptible to desire. This belief justified harsher discipline. If women were naturally unstable, then strict control became mercy in disguise. The logic was circular and devastating. Even within convents, class mattered. A nun from a noble family might receive confinement instead of expulsion. Her relatives could intervene, negotiate, or apply pressure. Poor nuns lacked such shields. They became convenient examples of disorder. Absorbing punishment meant to reassure authority. The injustice extended beyond discipline into memory. Men involved in scandals often vanished from records, unnamed and untraced. Women remained documented in painful detail, their punishment preserved while male responsibility fades. History remembers imbalance because the system recorded it. Unequal punishment was not a flaw in convent discipline. It was one of its core features. Control worked best when fear flowed in one direction by ensuring that nuns bore the full weight of transgression. The church maintained hierarchy, protected reputation, and reinforced obedience. In medieval convents, justice was not blind. It knew exactly who it could afford to lose. One of the most striking aspects of convent punishment is how often it exceeded the severity of secular justice outside the cloister. Even serious offenses were governed by defined laws, time limits, and in some cases, negotiation or pardon. Inside the convent, discipline was open-ended, absolute, and insulated from outside scrutiny. A woman accused in a town court could appeal to family, local custom, or even flee, and none could do none of these. Once enclosed, she lived under a parallel legal system where abbesses and bishops acted as judge, jury, and executioner of social life. Punishment was not measured in days or fines, but in obedience and submission, concepts with no clear endpoint. Secular prisons were harsh, but they were understood as punishment. Convent discipline was framed as correction. This distinction mattered because punishment was described as spiritual medicine. There was no obligation to limit its duration or severity. If suffering continued, it was interpreted as necessary. If the nun broke under it, that was proof of guilt, not excess. In some cases, secular law would have been more merciful. A woman accused of sexual misconduct outside a convent might face public shame or a fine, but she retained mobility and the possibility of rebuilding her life. A nun faced lifelong enclosure, erasure, or abandonment. The church punished not just the act, but the identity. This harshness was intentional. Convents relied on discipline to maintain the illusion of sanctity. If vows could be broken without devastating consequences, the entire system weakened. Severity preserved fear, and fear preserved order. Ironically, the church's insistence on internal discipline sometimes shielded nuns from secular violence, but at the cost of freedom. A nun avoided public execution or corporal punishment only by submitting to a quieter, longer suffering behind walls. Mercy and cruelty were entangled. The absence of oversight made abuse easy. There were no inspections focused on well-being, only on obedience. Complaints were treated as defiance. Appeals disappeared into hierarchy. Discipline became self-justifying. Compared to secular law, convent punishment was invisible, indefinite, and unchallengeable. It left no public record of cruelty, only obedient silence, and in many ways that made it far more effective. The cloister promised protection from the world. For punished nuns, it delivered something else entirely, a justice system with no exit. At the end of every punishment stood the same unspoken goal: fear. Medieval convent discipline was not designed to create moral insight or healing. It was designed to prevent repetition, and fear, carefully cultivated, proved more reliable than faith alone. Each punishment, whether isolation, hunger, humiliation, enclosure, or expulsion, served a dual purpose. It corrected the individual and educated the community. Nuns learned not only what was forbidden, but what would happen if they crossed invisible lines. Details were rarely discussed openly, but consequences were understood through absence, silence, and whispered knowledge. Fear reshaped behavior long before any vow was broken. It limited friendships, it moderated speech, it discouraged emotional attachment. Nuns learned to regulate themselves, not because they fully agreed with the rules, but because deviation was dangerous. Discipline worked best when it no longer needed to be applied. This system also preserved institutional stability. By making punishment unpredictable and severe, authority remained unquestioned. The abbess did not need to threaten. Her power was already internalized. Obedience became instinctive. The tragedy is that fear outlived guilt. Even nuns, who never broke their vows, lived under constant self-surveillance. Joy became suspicious. Affection became risky. Silence became safety. The convent produced compliance, not through holiness, but through anxiety. Church writers celebrated this as order. Historians see it as control. The system functioned, but at a human cost rarely acknowledged in contemporary records. Pain left no scars that could be inspected. Fear left no documents. It lived in behavior. Punishment in medieval convents was not exceptional. It was foundational. It shaped daily life, relationships, and identity. The threat mattered more than the act. Most nuns obeyed, not because they were saints, but because they understood the alternative. In the end, convent discipline reveals something uncomfortable. Institutions that demand perfection often rely on fear to sustain it. The walls held, the rules endured, but what they protected was not purity alone. It was authority maintained by the quiet understanding that breaking a vow could cost everything. In antiquity, love was rarely treated as something soft or sentimental. It was understood as a force that disrupted households, bent reason, and ruined carefully arranged lives. Desire was not romanticized as destiny, it was feared as chaos. Ancient people did not ask whether love was beautiful. They asked how to survive it, control it, or weaponize it. Greek and Roman writers described love as an illness that entered the body without permission. Plato compared it to madness. Physicians wrote about love's sickness as a genuine medical condition, complete with symptoms: insomnia, loss of appetite, obsession, trembling, and melancholy. If love could make the body sick, then it could also be treated. This belief laid the foundation for aphrodisiacs, charms, and elixir meant to ignite, redirect, or intensify desire. Attraction was thought to operate on multiple levels at once. It flowed through bodily fluids, breath, scent, and heat. It was influenced by the gods, especially Aphrodite, Os, and later Venus and Cupid, who were believed to strike without warning. When divine forces were involved, human intervention felt not only justified but necessary. If the gods caused love, humans would counter them with ingredients, rituals, and formulas. This made love deeply practical. Marriage was often arranged. Affairs were dangerous. A failed seduction could mean social ruin, while a successful one could shift inheritance, alliances, or power. Winning affection was not merely personal, it was strategic. And so lovers turned to substances believed to tip the balance in their favor. Markets sold roots, powders, animal products, and wines advertised for desire. Midwives, healers, and wise women acted as consultants in matters of the heart. Recipes circulated quietly, often disguised as medical advice or religious practice. Some promised irresistible attraction. Others claimed to restore fading passion or bind a lover permanently. What mattered was not whether these substances actually worked by modern standards. What mattered was belief. If desire was physical, then ingesting the right thing made sense. If attraction was magical, then ritual mattered as much as chemistry. Love became something that could be brewed, swallowed, worn, or whispered into existence. In a world without romantic certainty, aphrodisiacs offered hope. They gave lovers the illusion of control over something terrifyingly unpredictable. Love in antiquity was not trusted, it was managed. Few aphrodisiacs in antiquity inspired as much fascination and fear as mandra. This twisted root, often resembling a human body, occupied a strange space between medicine, magic, and nightmare. To ancient eyes, mandra did not merely look alive, it behaved as if it were. Greek and Roman writers believed mandra carried potent sexual and emotional power. Its shape suggested human anatomy, which made it an obvious candidate for influencing desire. According to sympathetic magic, like a root shaped like a body, could act upon the body. Mandra was believed to awaken lust, restore fertility, and bind lovers together with almost irresistible force. Harvesting it was considered dangerous. Legends warned that mandra screamed when pulled from the earth, a sound so deadly it could kill the listener. To avoid this fate, elaborate rituals were prescribed. Dogs were sometimes tied to the root and encouraged to pull it free while the harvester stood at a safe distance, preferably with ears covered. Whether anyone actually believed the scream was lethal mattered less than the ritual itself. Fear amplified belief. Once obtained, mandra could be prepared in multiple ways. It was dried and ground into powders, steeped in wine, or mixed into ointments. Small doses were believed to arouse desire or induce deep sleep. Larger doses were known to be dangerous. Ancient physicians were aware that mandra could cause hallucinations, paralysis, and even death. This only enhanced its reputation. A substance powerful enough to harm must also be powerful enough to seduce. Mandra blurred the line between love potion and poison. This ambiguity made it useful in both seduction and control. Some recipes aimed to inflame passion, others aimed to dull resistance. The difference was often a matter of dosage, not intention. Love, in this context, was not always mutual. Women were frequently associated with mandrake use, especially in literary sources written by men. The root became a symbol of dangerous female knowledge, a plant linked to sexuality, reproduction, and manipulation. Yet men sought it just as eagerly, hoping to reclaim virility or secure affection. Mandra's power lay as much in its myth as in its chemistry. It represented the ancient belief that desire could be summoned through the earth itself. Love, like the root, had to be dug up, wrestled from the ground, and handled carefully, or it would turn on you. If mandra symbolized mysterious desire, bull's blood represented something far more aggressive. In antiquity, the bull was the ultimate emblem of masculine power, strength, fertility, dominance, and uncontrollable force. Consuming anything derived from a bull was believed to transfer those qualities directly into the body. Blood, the essence of life itself, was thought to be especially potent. Ancient sources mention bull's blood in unsettling ways. Some texts describe it as a powerful aphrodisiac, capable of igniting overwhelming sexual drive. Others warned that it was deadly poison. Both ideas existed side by side, and this contradiction did not weaken belief, it strengthened it. A substance that could kill was assumed to also possess extreme power. Love and death were often imagined as neighbors. In practice, actual bull's blood was dangerous to consume due to coagulation and toxicity. Ancient physicians knew this, which suggests that many bull's blood elixir were symbolic, diluted, or substituted with safer ingredients associated with bulls, such as organs, fat, or wine, dedicated through ritual sacrifice. What mattered was not biological accuracy, but symbolic transfer, strength in, weakness out. Bull imagery dominated fertility rituals across Greece, Rome, and the Near East. Sacrificial blood was offered to gods associated with reproduction and desire. Drinking or touching consecrated liquid was believed to bind the participant to divine potency. In this context, aphrodisiacs were not merely chemical aids, they were religious acts. Unlike mandra, bull's blood was overwhelmingly associated with male sexuality. It promised dominance rather than attraction, conquest rather than persuasion. The goal was not mutual desire, but overwhelming force of presence. A man did not wish to be loved, he wished to be irresistible. This reveals an uncomfortable truth about ancient aphrodisiacs. Many were not designed to enhance shared intimacy, they were designed to overcome reluctance, fatigue, or social barriers. Desire was something to be provoked, even imposed rather than negotiated. Stories of bull's blood appear frequently in cautionary tales. Men who sought unnatural virility often met tragic ends, consumed by the very power they tried to absorb. These stories functioned as warnings disguised as myths. Desire pursued through excess leads to ruin. Bull's blood, whether literal or symbolic, embodied an ancient fear. Love amplified by force did not remain controllable. Once unleashed, it threatened the body, the mind, and the order of society itself. While Mandra and bull's blood belonged to the darker edge of ancient aphrodisiacs, oysters occupied a far more acceptable place at the table. They were sensual without being overtly dangerous, luxurious without appearing magical, and most importantly, edible. In antiquity, oysters became the respectable face of desire. The association began with the sea. Aphrodite, goddess of love, was born from the foam of the ocean. Anything drawn from the water carried erotic symbolism by default. Oysters hidden inside rough shells and revealed only when pried open seemed designed for metaphor. Ancient writers rarely resisted the comparison. Closed, modest, and plain on the outside, soft, moist, and suggestive within. Greek and Roman elites believed oysters stimulated desire through abundance and richness. They were expensive, transported alive over long distances, and served fresh at banquets where excess itself was part of the appeal. To eat oysters was to signal wealth, leisure, and indulgence, all conditions thought to encourage romance. Unlike more extreme aphrodisiacs, oysters did not promise transformation. They promised readiness. A body well fed, warmed by wine, and softened by luxury was assumed to be more receptive to pleasure. Desire was not forced into existence. It was coaxed out through comfort. Roman authors such as Pliny the Elder praised oysters for their invigorating properties, while sadists mocked men who consumed them obsessively in pursuit of sexual stamina. The joke worked because the belief was widespread. Everyone knew what oysters were for, even if no one said it directly. Oysters also allowed women participation without suspicion. Drinking mandra wine raised eyebrows. Serving oysters at dinner did not. This made them socially useful. Desire could be cultivated without appearing desperate or dangerous. Aphrodisiacs worked best when they blended into everyday life. Yet oysters still carried moral tension. Excessive indulgence was linked to decadence, softness, and loss of discipline. Philosophers warned that constant stimulation weakened character. Desire, once awakened too easily, became difficult to restrain. Even the safest aphrodisiac carried risk. Oysters reveal something essential about ancient love culture. Not all desire was summoned through spells or blood. Much of it was nurtured through environment, status, and sensory pleasure. The ancient world understood something modern discussions often forget. Attraction thrives when the body feels secure, fed, and indulged. In the end, oysters did not promise magic. They promised mood. And in antiquity, mood was half the battle. Beyond roots, blood, and seafood, ancient lovers turned to something far less tangible: magic. Love was not only consumed, it was invoked. Elixirs, charms, and whispered formulas formed an entire underground economy of desire, operating at the edges of religion, medicine, and superstition. These elixirs rarely relied on a single ingredient. Recipes combined herbs, wine, honey, oils, ash, hair, nail clippings, and bodily fluids. What mattered was not flavor or safety, but symbolism. Each component carried meaning: honey for sweetness, wine for warmth, hair for personal connection. Mixing them created a physical representation of emotional intention. Words mattered as much as substances. Ancient magical papyri preserve love spells that read like desperate negotiations with the universe. Names of gods were invoked repeatedly. Commands were spoken aloud. Some spells demanded obedience from the target, instructing them to feel burning desire, sleepless longing, and unbearable attraction until union was achieved. Love was framed as compulsion, not choice. These practices crossed social boundaries. Enslaved people, courtesans, soldiers, merchants, and elite women all used love magic. It thrived precisely because official society offered few acceptable ways to pursue desire freely. When marriage was arranged and reputation fragile, magic offered secrecy and hope. Women appear frequently in surviving sources as practitioners, though this reflects male anxiety as much as reality. A woman who used love magic was portrayed as dangerous, manipulative, and unnatural. Yet the spells themselves suggest vulnerability. Many ask not for domination, but for affection, return, or relief from loneliness. Magic was a response to powerlessness, as often as it was a tool of control. Elixirs were typically administered covertly, mixed into drinks, applied to skin, burned, and inhaled. Consent was rarely considered. The goal was effect, not ethics. If desire could be triggered without the target's awareness, it was considered effective, not immoral. Authorities distrusted love magic intensely. Greek philosophers dismissed it as deception. Roman law occasionally prosecuted it as harmful sorcery, especially when outcomes turned violent or obsessive. This reinforced its reputation. Forbidden tools always feel more powerful. What these elixirs reveal is not ancient ignorance, but ancient anxiety. Love was unpredictable, dangerous, and socially risky. Magic offered the illusion of control over something terrifyingly uncertain. In a world without emotional freedom, whispered words and secret mixtures felt safer than honesty. Desire, once again, was not trusted to emerge on its own. It had to be summoned, commanded, or forced into being. Not all ancient aphrodisiacs were wrapped in magic or excess. Some belonged firmly to medicine. Ancient physicians believed that desire, like any bodily state, could fall out of balance. Too much passion weakened the body. Too little signaled illness. Love, when unmanaged, became pathology. Greek medical writers described lovesickness as a real condition, not a metaphor. Patients suffered from insomnia, loss of appetite, erratic behavior, and obsessive thoughts focused on a single person. Physicians did not dismiss this as poetry. They diagnosed it. The body, they believed, was overwhelmed by heat, dryness, or imbalance of humors. Treatment varied. Sometimes the cure was fulfillment. If desire caused illness, satisfying it could restore equilibrium. This advice was dangerous, especially for women and enslaved people whose consent or circumstances made fulfillment impossible. When union could not occur, doctors turned to substitutes. Wine infused with herbs was prescribed to warm the blood and calm the nerves. Certain foods were recommended to stimulate circulation or soften emotional rigidity. Baths, massages, and aromatics played a role. Smell was thought to influence desire directly, bypassing reason. Fragrant oils and incense were medical tools as much as luxuries. Some treatments aimed to reduce desire rather than increase it. Love was useful when mutual. It was dangerous when obsessive. Physicians walked a fine line between encouraging attraction and suppressing it. Aphrodisiacs and anaphrodisiacs existed side by side, both framed as health interventions. What stands out is how physical the ancient understanding of love was. Emotion did not live in the heart alone. It flowed through blood, breath, and temperature. If the body could be adjusted, the feeling would follow. This logic made aphrodisiacs respectable. They were not spells, they were prescriptions. This medical framing also gave cover to desire. A lover was not indulgent. He or she was treating an ailment. The language of health disguised the urgency of longing. Lovesickness reveals how seriously antiquity took desire. It was powerful enough to kill, cure, or consume. Aphrodisiacs were not indulgences. They were interventions in a world where love was dangerous, destabilizing, and impossible to ignore. To ancient minds, ignoring desire was not virtuous. Managing it was survival. Aphrodisiacs in antiquity were never neutral tools. They operated inside systems of power, status, and inequality, and the risks of using them were rarely shared equally. Desire might have been universal, but the consequences of acting on it were not. For elite men, aphrodisiacs were indulgences. A failed potion meant embarrassment, wasted money, or ridicule in satire. For women, enslaved people, and those without protection, the stakes were far higher. Being accused of using love magic could destroy reputations, invite legal punishment, or justify violence. The same act, read as playful excess in one context, became dangerous manipulation in another. Women, in particular, were associated with aphrodisiacs in hostile sources. Male writers portrayed them as secretive brewers of potions, corrupting men through unnatural means. This narrative reflected fear, not fact. Women often had fewer legitimate ways to pursue desire, refuse unwanted attention, or escape arranged marriages. Aphrodisiacs and love magic offered leverage in a world stacked against them. Enslaved people occupied an even more precarious position. Their bodies were controlled by others, yet they were blamed for desire directed toward them. Aphrodisiacs appear in sources as tools of both survival and accusation. An enslaved person might use a potion to secure favor or protection, while being accused of seduction to justify punishment. Desire became a liability they could not refuse. Power also shaped consent. Many aphrodisiacs were administered without the knowledge of the recipient. Mixed into wine, food, or oils, they blurred the line between attraction and coercion. Ancient culture rarely questioned this. Desire mattered more than agreement. Success was measured by effect, not ethics. This imbalance explains why aphrodisiacs were both popular and feared. They threatened social order by bypassing hierarchy. If desire could be chemically or magically induced, then class, gender, and authority lost some of their control. That possibility made aphrodisiacs feel subversive, even when widely used. Laws occasionally targeted love magic, but enforcement was inconsistent. Punishment followed scandal, not principle. Once again, status determined outcome. Power absorbed risk. Aphrodisiacs reveal a hard truth about ancient love. Desire was not just personal, it was political, and tools meant to kindle passion often exposed who could afford to desire freely, and who paid for it afterward. Not everyone in antiquity believed in aphrodisiacs without question. Alongside recipes and rituals ran a parallel tradition of doubt, mockery, and quiet skepticism. Philosophers, physicians, and sadists often treated love potions as signs of desperation rather than power. Greek thinkers, like Hippocrates, and later medical writers, warned that many so-called aphrodisiacs worked less through chemistry than suggestion. If a lover believed a potion would ignite passion, the body might respond accordingly. This did not make the effect meaningless, but it did shift responsibility from the ingredient to the mind. Desire in this view was psychological before it was physical. Roman sadists seized on this idea with enthusiasm. Wealthy men chasing virility through oysters, rare wines, and exotic powders became stock characters. They were mocked as ridiculous, aging, and afraid of decline. Aphrodisiacs symbolized insecurity more than potency. The joke worked because the audience recognized the behavior. Some physicians openly cautioned against extreme remedies. Substances like mandra and bull derivatives were acknowledged as dangerous. Love pursued through poisoning the body was foolish, not heroic. Excessive stimulation weakened health, dulled reason, and led to obsession rather than satisfaction. Yet, skepticism never killed the practice. It coexisted with belief. Even those who doubted specific ingredients often accepted the broader logic. Mood mattered, environment mattered, expectation mattered. A potion might fail chemically, but succeed socially by signaling intent, effort, or seriousness. This tension reveals something important. Aphrodisiacs did not need to work consistently to remain popular. They needed to offer hope. In a world where love was uncertain and rejection costly, any tool that promised advantage retained value. Satire also served a protective function. By laughing at aphrodisiacs, elite men distanced themselves from vulnerability. Mockery turned anxiety into humor. If love could be joked about, it felt less dangerous. Skepticism, however, rarely extended to women or marginalized groups. Doubt was a privilege. Those with power could afford to dismiss aphrodisiacs as nonsense. Those without power relied on them as strategy. In the end, antiquity understood a paradox that still holds. Desire cannot be fully controlled, but it can be influenced. Aphrodisiacs sat at the boundary between hope and delusion, mocked and trusted at the same time, and that was enough to keep them alive. When the dust settles, ancient aphrodisiacs reveal less about chemistry and more about fear. Mandra, bulls, blood, oysters, and whispered spells were not just tools for seduction. They were responses to a world where love was risky, reputation fragile, and choice limited. Aphrodisiacs promised control in situations where control rarely existed. They offered something to do when honesty was dangerous, consent uncertain, and rejection costly. Whether they worked mattered less than what they represented: action instead of waiting, intervention instead of helplessness. Ancient people did not believe love should be spontaneous and pure. They believed it was disruptive and dangerous. Left unmanaged, it ruined families, destabilized politics, and weakened discipline. Aphrodisiacs were attempts to tame that force, to guide it toward acceptable outcomes, or at least survivable ones. Some ingredients had real physiological effects. Others relied entirely on belief. Most sat in between. The line between medicine, magic, and manipulation was thin because ancient thought did not separate them the way modern culture does. Body and mind were inseparable. Expectation shaped experience. There is also an uncomfortable truth beneath the romance. Many aphrodisiacs were designed not to enhance mutual desire, but to override hesitation. Ancient love culture prioritized outcome over ethics. Attraction was something to be produced, not negotiated. That mindset shaped the ingredients chosen and the methods used. And yet, for all their danger, aphrodisiacs also speak to vulnerability. They reveal people afraid of being unwanted, aging, ignored, or powerless. They show longing dressed up as ritual, fear disguised as confidence. Behind every potion was someone hoping not to be rejected. In the end, ancient aphrodisiacs did not guarantee love. They guaranteed belief. Belief that desire could be influenced. Belief that action mattered. Belief that love, terrifying and uncontrollable, could be nudged into shape. That belief alone was powerful enough to survive for centuries.